Have you ever imagined what it would be like to live in a world where your daily work was a fight for survival? Today, we're going to explore the 10 most brutal and deadly professions of the Middle Ages, the ones no one would ever want to have. Get ready for a dive into the most extreme and horrific conditions workers faced back then. And if you're not subscribed yet, don't waste any time. Click subscribe now so you don't miss any content. Let's start this journey through time and see what life really was like. If you dare. Imagine descending into hell. No, I'm not talking about a metaphor or some horror movie. I'm talking about a brutal reality that millions of men and children faced during the Middle Ages. The job of a coal miner was undoubtedly one of the deadliest and most inhumane in history. At that time, mining was done in a rudimentary way, without any kind of protection or modern technology. Miners, men and even children as young as 6 years old, spent their entire lives in deep, dark and claustrophobic mines. They descended through narrow tunnels, many of which extended kilometers below the earth, digging for or with simple pickaxes and wooden tools. The light was scarce, if there was any at all. Lighting came from torches, which, in their fragility, posed a constant risk of explosions. And yes, these explosions happened with devastating frequency. Imagine the scene: you're working exhaustively, and suddenly a horrific explosion occurs. Entire teams are pulverized or buried, with no chance to escape. All for a miserable wage and a life in absolutely unhealthy conditions. And even without explosions, the air inside these mines was filled with rock and coal dust. With every breath, the miners' lungs were slowly destroyed. Diseases like silicosis and pneumoconiosis, though unknown at the time, were a guaranteed death sentence. The miner died slowly, with an agonizing cough, unable to breathe properly, until succumbing to a lack of oxygen or lung failure. It was an exhausting job, where the average life expectancy of a medieval miner didn't exceed 30 years. And even if they reached that age, they were completely debilitated by disease, destroyed by the violence of the work, the lack of hygiene, and the unbearable environment they were forced to live in. They were condemned to darkness and slow death for a meager salary, living in isolated worker villages, where the only company was the same deadly dust that consumed them. Now, stop for a second and think. You who have probably struggled to breathe in a stifling environment, could you endure a whole life like that? A life where the only way out would be death from dust inhalation or an explosion that could happen at any moment. The medieval miner faced hell on earth, with no chance to escape. Now, imagine the feeling of having to execute someone. It's not something anyone in their right mind would choose to do, right? But in the Middle Ages, being an executioner was an essential job. And although justice at the time was often a matter of life or death, being an executioner was much more than just carrying out sentences. It was a life marked by fear, disdain, and isolation. The executioner was the hand that brought death, and he was not a hero, quite the opposite. He was feared, hated, and in many cases, avoided by society. He was an outcast. People saw him as a monster, someone who did the dirty, brutal work that no one else wanted to do. Imagine living in a village where everyone looks at you with disgust, where your presence sends shivers down their spines, where even touching someone could be seen as an act of impurity. His life was filled with loneliness. He lived in isolated neighborhoods, far from the respectable people. He couldn't go to taverns or participate in celebrations. He had no friends, no family nearby who would want to interact with him. To medieval society, the executioner was a marginalized being. But the most terrifying aspect of his profession wasn't just the social isolation, it was the constant fear of making a mistake. A botched execution could mean the lynching of the executioner by the enraged crowd. The pressure to be quick, efficient, and precise was overwhelming. And the feeling of being constantly watched while performing society's most horrific task must have been an unbearable psychological burden. Every move, every strike, was being judged by everyone, and any slip-up could mean his own death. And the reward for this life of terror: the executioner earned a considerable sum for the job, but it came with a very high price. He bore the stain of having taken lives, the burden of being a social outcast, and in many cases, a soul destroyed by living in constant fear and contempt. No wealth or status could make up for the psychological torment and life of suffering. Living as an executioner was undoubtedly living an existence where death was never far away, both for others and for himself. It was a life marked by horror, loneliness, and the guilt that weighed on every breath. Now, imagine being the person responsible for something that, for us, is absolutely unthinkable. Assisting the king with his bodily functions. It may sound like a joke, but in the Middle Ages, the role of Groom of the Stool was one of the most important and, at the same time, most humiliating positions in the English court. The job of the Groom of the Stool was simple but incredibly intimate. He prepared the king's portable toilet, patiently waited while the monarch relieved himself, and, to top it all off, cleaned the king afterward using fine linen or velvet. The attendant to the royal stool. It may seem like a degrading job, but it was a position of immense trust and closeness to the royal family. Beyond the physical work and constant humiliation, there were the invisible dangers of the profession. The medieval period was marked by a lack of hygiene and basic sanitation. Constant proximity to the king's excretions put the attendant at risk for intestinal diseases, infections, and all the illnesses that microbes could cause in such a filthy environment. The paradox of this profession was that, despite the humiliating nature of the task, the Groom of the Stool had direct access to the king's secrets, becoming a trusted advisor and, often, a powerful figure in the political landscape. So, on one hand, he was despised for his extremely intimate and filthy task, but on the other, he enjoyed considerable political power from being so close to the monarch. The life of the Groom of the Stool was a bizarre mix of shame, power, and the constant risk of diseases. He knew everything about the king's life, his most intimate secrets, but he was also exposed to the danger of diseases that could kill him at any moment. A job that involved serving in the most private and degrading situations, but at the same time, granting the attendant enormous political influence, something rare and highly valued in medieval society. This job was not just about physical disgust, but also about constant exposure to the risk of contamination, diseases, and, worse yet, social disrespect. Even though the Groom of the Stool held a position of power within the court, the nature of his job condemned him to a life of stigma and shame. Imagine the mental and emotional pressure he faced, knowing that his function was essential to the kingdom's operation, but at the same time, a constant source of disdain. Now, if you think the stool attendant's job was unbearable, prepare yourself for something even more terrifying and grotesque. In the Middle Ages, the job of a blood leech collector was a truly absurd profession. But, unbelievably, it was an essential task for the doctors of the time. This job, which today seems like a nightmare, essentially involved turning the human body into a kind of live bait for leeches. Leeches were seen as an indispensable medical tool in the Middle Ages. The practice of bloodletting, removing blood to cure diseases, was common, based on the theory of the four humors. And to carry out this task, someone had to go out and collect the leeches in large quantities. But how was this done? The blood leech collector, both men, women, and even children, spent their entire days and sometimes nights walking through swamps, lakes, and streams infested with leeches. These workers used their own legs, ankles, and even arms as live bait to attract the leeches, which would latch onto their skin and feed on their blood. Imagine the pain and disgust of this profession. The leeches would attach to the collector's skin, sucking blood for hours. Removing them was a painful process, and the open wounds they left were gateways to serious infections, hard-to-heal ulcers, and other diseases. Moreover, the swamps and stagnant waters where the leech collectors worked were known to harbor diseases transmitted by mosquitoes, like malaria, as well as parasites. The unsanitary environment and constant risk of infection made this job even more terrifying. It wasn't just the fact that they came into contact with the leeches that made the job so deadly, but also the fact that the workers' own bodies became tools of exploitation, being slowly drained by these creatures. It was a life of physical sacrifice, painful and unbearable, all for a meager payment. For the blood leech collector, death, disease, and suffering were constant companions. Imagine the horror of submitting to this every day, risking fatal diseases and living with open wounds on your body, all for a paltry payment for each leech collected. The life of a blood leech collector was one marked by pain, disease, and an ongoing feeling of being discarded by society. Now, imagine being one of the few people willing to face death up close, every single day, with no escape. In the Middle Ages, during the outbreaks of the Black Death and other devastating diseases, the job of the plague gravedigger was not only vital for the survival of the cities, but also a death sentence almost guaranteed. The job of a plague gravedigger was simple but horrific: to collect the bodies of the dead, many of them fallen in the streets, abandoned in their homes, or lying in the beds of their families. The number of dead was so large that, in many cases, the gravediggers had to pile the bodies scattered throughout the city, in plain sight. The stench of death and decomposition was overwhelming. There were no protective masks, gloves, or any kind of equipment that we would consider essential today to avoid contamination. The plague gravedigger was literally immersed in a sea of decaying bodies. The continuous exposure to the plague and other contagious diseases meant that their lives were short, often lasting only a few weeks or, at best, months. They were constantly dealing with death and the imminent risk of infection. Every body they collected could be a death sentence for the gravedigger himself. The work was relentless, with no breaks, because death didn't take holidays. The plague gravediggers worked without rest, day and night, in an attempt to control the death toll and prevent an even greater epidemic. They were the invisible heroes, yet the most condemned by medieval society. It was a job that involved not only the physical task of burying the dead, but also the psychological torture of being surrounded by death all the time, not knowing if the next body would be theirs. The life expectancy of a plague gravedigger was extremely low. They lived on the edge of survival, with the constant shadow of death hanging over their heads. Each day was a struggle, and each night, the feeling of being closer to the end grew stronger. The life of a plague gravedigger was an existence without hope, without rest, and marked by the certainty that death was closer than anyone could imagine. Being a blacksmith in the Middle Ages was undoubtedly one of the most exhausting and unhealthy jobs one could choose. Despite its vital importance in medieval society, the blacksmith's work was a constant test of physical and mental endurance. Imagine spending your days in a stifling workshop, where the heat from the forge is almost unbearable, the sound of the hammer striking metal is incessant, and the toxic smoke fills the air to the point that it's hard to breathe. This was the daily routine of a medieval blacksmith. The heat in the forges could reach extremely high temperatures, especially during the summer months. The blacksmith worked in an almost unbearable environment, where the only thing left to do was keep hammering the metal, day after day, to produce tools, weapons, horseshoes, and other essential items for medieval life. The work was not only physically exhausting but also extremely dangerous. The sparks flying from each hammer strike could cause severe burns and permanent blindness. Imagine having to work with fire and molten metal just inches from your skin, with a constant threat of being seriously injured. In addition, the air was saturated with dense smoke and toxic particles from the burning of coal and substances released by the manipulation of metal. Respiratory diseases were common among blacksmiths, with many developing chronic bronchitis or silicosis due to the constant inhalation of these harmful substances. Their hands and arms were frequently burned and scarred, and many blacksmiths became physically deformed by the repetitive effort of hammering the metal. The physical wear and tear was so severe that many aged prematurely, their bodies destroyed by the relentless work. Being a blacksmith in the Middle Ages was not just a profession, but a sentence of constant pain. The blacksmiths faced the immense heat of the forges, the constant danger of accidents, and the deterioration of their own physical condition, all in exchange for a life of incessant labor and modest wages. There was no rest, no protection, and, above all, no other option. For the blacksmiths, the only way to survive was to keep hammering until their bodies finally gave out. It was a life marked by pain, exhaustion, and the certainty that physical deterioration would be a constant companion until the end. Now, let's talk about one of the most disgusting, foul-smelling, and revolting jobs of the Middle Ages: the flayer, or remover of skin and flesh from dead animals. This job was one of the most marginal occupations in medieval society, yet, paradoxically, extremely necessary. The flayer was responsible for handling the carcasses of animals that died from disease, old age, or accidents, but were not discarded or consumed, instead being repurposed for leather, candles, and soap production. Working with decaying carcasses was a horrible routine. The smell of rotting flesh that spread everywhere was unbearable, permeating the flayer's skin, clothes, and even their hair. The stench was so intense that these workers were forced to live and work in areas far from the city, in designated spots for disposing of dead animals, to prevent the odor and risk of contamination from spreading to residential areas. But social isolation was not the worst part of this profession. A flayer's job involved cutting and removing skins, muscles, and flesh from dead animals. This was done manually with knives and other rudimentary tools, which increased the risk of infection. Each cut exposed the flayer to diseases transmitted by animals, such as zoonoses, as well as parasites and worms. The work with decaying bodies was not only physically exhausting, but also psychologically torturing, as the flayer was constantly in contact with death and decomposition. In addition, the working conditions were deplorable. Without hygiene, without protection, and with a constant risk of infected wounds, the flayers were destined to live a life of misery and disease. They were marginalized by society, seen as impure, and had little or no chance of a healthy life. The stench and dirt they lived with daily became part of their identity, making it difficult to have any social interaction with respectable people. The flayer's profession was a testament to the cruelty and harshness of medieval life, where survival often came at the cost of physical and psychological health. Imagine spending your days immersed in an environment of rot, with the stench penetrating every cell of your body, and your daily work involving the handling of waste and decaying materials. The job of a leather tanner in the Middle Ages was all this and more. It was a vital trade for the production of clothing, shoes, and equipment, but it was also one of the most degrading, unhealthy, and dangerous professions that existed. The leather tanning process involved removing the hair, flesh, and fat from animal hides, then soaking them in large vats filled with extremely corrosive chemical solutions. But the worst part was yet to come. These solutions were not made from common ingredients, as one might imagine. To soften and treat the hides, tanners used dog and pigeon feces, and even human and animal urine, which provided ammonia and other chemicals necessary for the process. Now imagine having to work with your bare hands submerged in these vats of rotten and corrosive substances. The smell was absolutely unbearable, soaking the tanner's clothes and skin permanently. The constant exposure to these substances led many to develop severe chemical burns on their hands and arms, as well as serious respiratory illnesses due to inhaling the toxic fumes released by the vats. The health of the tanners was compromised every day. The stench of decomposition and chemicals was so intense that these workers were forced to live in isolated neighborhoods, separated from society, to prevent the unbearable smell from spreading through the towns. Their lives were marked by skin diseases, respiratory difficulties, hearing loss due to constant exposure to the noise of the vats, and chronic pain caused by the constant handling of heavy and corrosive materials. Although it was an essential profession for the production of goods that everyone used, the leather tanner was a true martyr, condemned to a life of physical pain, illness, and social repulsion. The price of leather, something so valued in medieval society, was paid with the health and dignity of the worker. And despite being a necessary profession, no one would want to be in these workers' shoes. The profession of linen breaker in the Middle Ages might seem at first glance like a simple and even peaceful task, as though it was just part of the fabric-making process. However, behind this apparent peace lay one of the most dangerous and unhealthy occupations of all. The workers who broke the linen faced a true fight against death, and the invisible risk that hung over them came from the linen fibers themselves. The job involved breaking the tough stalks of the linen plant to separate the fibers from the woody part, an essential process to transform the linen into a strong fabric. This task was done manually, using large wooden hammers or simple machines that struck the stalks violently to break the fibers. The physical pressure to do this repetitive work was exhausting, but the real danger lay in the air. As the linen was broken, the air became saturated with fine linen dust, plant fragments, and microscopic fibers. This dust, invisible to the naked eye, was highly toxic and, when inhaled continuously, caused a terrible respiratory condition known as Bazanos, or brown lung disease. Workers developed a severe cough, difficulty breathing, and eventually lung failure. It was a stealthy disease that workers could not detect at first, but which slowly condemned them to death while their lives were torn apart by a simple, repetitive, and necessary task. Moreover, the risk of injury was constant. The breaking machines or heavy hammers could trap the workers' fingers, hands, and even arms, resulting in amputations or permanent injuries. And contrary to what one might expect, the working conditions were miserable. There was no protection for the hands or eyes, and workers were forced to continue working even as their physical conditions deteriorated. The linen breaker lived a life of immense physical wear, respiratory suffering, and an early death caused by an invisible, yet lethal, disease. They were always between a rock and a hard place, with their working conditions in terrible shape, without any protection. The linen they turned into comfortable fabric for others cost them their own lives. Now, we arrive at the profession that represents the pinnacle of disgust, suffering, and degradation. The night soil men, or as they were called in the Middle Ages, gong farmers. This job, which seems unimaginable to any of us, was essential for medieval public health but at the same time condemned those who performed it to a life of misery and complete isolation. The job of a night soil man involved emptying cesspits, large tanks where human waste accumulated in homes and public buildings. They used hose and buckets to remove the contents of the cesspits, which often overflowed, creating a repulsive mixture of urine, feces, and other human waste. The unbearable stench was just a small part of the daily suffering these workers endured. They were in constant contact with toxic and pathogenic substances, making them vulnerable to a host of deadly infectious diseases, such as cholera, typhus, dysentery, and hepatitis. In addition to the risk of disease, the night soil men were exposed to the danger of asphyxiation by toxic gases, such as methane and hydrogen sulfide, which emitted a rotten egg smell and caused fainting, and even death by suffocation. These workers were forced to work at night, under the light of torches or the moon, to avoid contact with the population, further marginalizing them. Social isolation was one of the worst parts of this job. The night soil men were seen as outcasts, despised by all, as no one wanted to get close to them due to the unbearable stench and the risk of contamination. They lived in extreme poverty and were forced to carry plaques or identify themselves as workers of this profession, which further excluded them. Their lives were marked by shame, isolation, and the constant threat of fatal diseases. Although their profession was essential in preventing disease outbreaks and ensuring public health, the night soil men paid an extremely high price for it. They lived in constant suffering, surrounded by death and degradation, with a short life expectancy and deteriorating health. Every day at work was a battle against the stench, the diseases, and the certainty that, sooner or later, they themselves would fall victim to the cruel life they led. If you survived this journey through some of the most horrific professions of the Middle Ages, let me remind you, subscribe to the channel to keep exploring the darker side of history with us. Don't forget to hit the bell so you get all our updates and revealing videos. See you in the next one.